I found out in a bank lobby, on a Tuesday morning, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly unreal. I was standing at the counter with my ID in my hand when the manager stopped typing and looked at the screen a little too long. His voice lowered, not out of kindness, but habit. "There's no balance left in the joint account," he said. "It was cleared yesterday." I didn't react right away, not because I didn't understand, because I wanted the exact wording. I asked him to repeat it. "Cleared," he said again. "Zero." Behind me, someone laughed. A soft laugh, too young for the space. I turned and saw my husband, Daniel, leaning against the marble column near the entrance, his phone in one hand, his other hand resting casually on the back of a woman I had never met. She couldn't have been older than 25. Perfect posture, perfect confidence, the kind that comes from thinking you've already won. Daniel saw me and smiled, as if this were all going according to plan. "There you go," he said loudly, walking over. "I told you she'd get confused. She always does with numbers." The manager glanced at me, then back to his screen. He didn't correct Daniel. He didn't need to. Silence did enough. Daniel explained, still smiling, that he had transferred the funds to protect the assets. He said it like a man used to being believed. He said it like a husband explaining something to a wife who had waited too long to understand. The young woman stayed quiet. She watched me, not him. That told me more than any introduction could have. I asked the manager for a printed transaction summary. My voice was steady. I noticed that. Daniel noticed it too. His smile tightened. The paper slid across the counter. Dates, amounts, reference numbers. I scanned them slowly, not to absorb everything, but to find one thing that didn't fit. There it was. A transfer authorized at 6:42 a.m. from an IP address registered to an office that Daniel had claimed to close 6 months earlier. I folded the paper once, then again, neat, deliberate. Daniel leaned closer. "You don't have to make this dramatic." I didn't look at him. I looked up instead, past the manager, past the glass doors to the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. A red light blinked steadily. Recording. Time-stamped. Neutral. In that moment, something settled in me. Not anger. Alignment. If you were in my position, you might think the worst part was the money. It wasn't. Money can be traced. Money leaves records. The worst part was realizing how carefully Daniel had rehearsed this. How comfortable he was, saying it out loud, in public, with witnesses. The humiliation wasn't loud, it was procedural. The manager cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bennett," he said carefully, "if you'd like, I can place a temporary note on the account pending review." "Yes," I said. "One word, enough." Daniel scoffed. "Review? There's nothing to review." I met his eyes then. Calm. Observant. I didn't accuse him. I didn't defend myself. "I'll need a full transaction history," I said to the manager, "including linked accounts, beneficiary details, and any documentation authorizing third-party transfers." The manager nodded. He didn't look surprised. That mattered. Daniel's smile disappeared. For the first time that morning, he looked uncertain, not scared, just inconvenienced. The young woman shifted her weight. Her confidence cracked, just slightly. As we stood there, I realized something else. Daniel had assumed I would react emotionally, that I would argue, that I would ask why. Instead, I was already thinking in timelines. I thanked the manager and stepped away from the counter. Daniel followed me, lowering his voice now. "We can talk about this at home," he said. I picked up my purse. "No," I said. "We can talk about this later, through the right channels." He stared at me, searching for the version of me that used to explain herself. She wasn't there anymore. I walked out of the bank alone. The doors closed behind me with a soft mechanical sound. Not dramatic, just final. I didn't know everything yet, but I knew enough to stop asking questions. If you stay with stories that unfold quietly, where strength isn't loud but undeniable, this one is worth your time. You can support the channel with a like or a subscribe. It helps these stories find the people who need them. And if you feel inclined, leave a comment telling me which city you're listening from. I read them more often than you think. Now let me take you back to the moment before everything broke open, to a time when I still believed my marriage was stable and the ground beneath me wasn't already shifting. For a long time, my life looked stable from the outside. That was the illusion Daniel liked best. 5 years earlier, I had stepped back from my job as a compliance analyst, not because I was asked to, because it made sense at the time. Daniel's construction firm was expanding fast. New contracts, new partners, new risks. Someone needed to keep the household steady, to be available for our son, Ethan, to make sure at least one part of our life ran on schedule. Daniel called it teamwork. His family called it sacrifice. I didn't name it at all. At first, nothing felt wrong. I still handled our personal finances. I still reviewed statements. I still knew where the money went. Then, gradually, Daniel began to help. He took over bill payments. He suggested consolidating accounts. He said it would be easier if everything flowed through one central system. I didn't argue. I observed. The power imbalance didn't arrive all at once. It arrived disguised as convenience. When I asked questions, Daniel answered them, but with a smile that implied the questions were unnecessary. When I pushed back, he laughed and said I was overthinking things. "You don't need to worry about that anymore," he'd say. "I've got it handled." Handled became withheld. Within 2 years, I no longer had direct access to our primary business-linked accounts. Daniel explained it as liability protection. His accountant supported the idea. His attorney nodded politely during one dinner and said, "This is standard." What they meant was, this is standard when one person holds all the power. At family gatherings, Daniel was praised openly. A provider, a builder, a man who took care of everything. I was described differently. Supportive, calm, lucky. His sister Marilyn once told me, in front of everyone, "You're so fortunate. You don't have to stress about money at all." I smiled. Not because it was true, because correcting her would have required a conversation no one wanted to have. Daniel never raised his voice. That's important. There were no scenes, no visible abuse, just decisions made without me, and explanations offered after the fact. When Ethan asked why Dad traveled so much, Daniel said it was for our future. When I mentioned that I wanted to return to work part-time, Daniel said the timing wasn't right. When I suggested hiring an independent financial advisor, Daniel said we already had professionals. Each time, I deferred. Not out of fear, out of calculation. Silence, in that environment, was survival. Speaking without leverage only taught people how far they could push you. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I was really choosing was delay. By the 4th year, I noticed how carefully Daniel framed every disagreement as concern for me. He told friends I was stressed. He told his mother I worried too much. He told his colleagues I preferred not to be involved. None of those statements were lies. They were edits. The truth was simpler. I was being managed. Still, I stayed. Ethan was 13 then, smart, quiet, watching more than he spoke. I didn't want to fracture his sense of stability without certainty. I wanted evidence. I wanted clarity. I wanted a clean line between discomfort and danger. Daniel mistook my patience for compliance. At night, after everyone slept, I sometimes opened my old work files, not to act, just to remember how my mind worked when it was trusted, how I used to read documents for what they didn't say, how I followed money without assuming good intentions. I didn't yet believe I would need those skills again. From the outside, we were a successful family adjusting to growth. From the inside, authority had narrowed to one voice. Mine had not been silenced, it had been archived. I didn't fight back because there was nothing concrete to fight yet. No missing money, no undeniable breach, just patterns. And patterns, without proof, make you sound unstable. So I waited. I kept notes, dates, small inconsistencies, comments that didn't match behavior. I didn't call it preparation. I called it awareness. Looking back, that was the mistake Daniel made. He assumed silence meant surrender. He assumed normalcy would protect him. What he didn't understand was that toxic normalcy is still a structure, and structures leave traces. The trigger wasn't dramatic. That's what still unsettles me. It arrived as an automated email at 6:17 a.m., flagged as low priority, sent by a credit monitoring service I had signed up for years earlier and forgotten to cancel. I almost deleted it without opening it. Almost. The subject line was neutral. New account activity detected. I read it once, then again more slowly. A line of credit had been opened using marital assets as collateral. Not in my name, not jointly, authorized under Daniel's signature alone. There was nothing emotional in the message, just data, date, amount, lending institution, a digital footprint that didn't ask how I felt about it. I didn't confront Daniel right away. I made coffee. I watched Ethan eat breakfast and complain about a math quiz. I listened to Daniel talk about an upcoming site inspection like nothing in the world had shifted. Timing matters. Accusations made too early collapse into noise. That evening, after dinner, I asked casually, "Did we open a new line of credit recently?" Daniel didn't look up from his phone. "Why?" "No reason," I said. "I just got a notification." He smiled then. Not warmly. Practiced. "Those systems glitch all the time. You're probably reading it wrong." That was the first dismissal. I didn't argue. I nodded. "Maybe." Later that night, he added, almost as an afterthought, "You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe let me handle this stuff." Concern, framed as authority. The next morning, I checked the credit report directly. The account was real. The collateral listed matched our joint savings. The contact email for the account wasn't Daniel's business address. It belonged to someone else. I didn't need to guess who. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I saved screenshots, downloaded disclosures, logged timestamps. I reminded myself of something I learned early in my career. Misunderstandings dissolve under documentation. The pressure escalated externally before it did at home. 2 days later, Marilyn called. "Daniel's sister never called without a purpose. I heard you were questioning some financial decisions," she said. Her tone was light, rehearsed concern. "You know how sensitive these things are for Daniel right now." I asked how she knew. She paused. "He mentioned it." "Of course he did. He's carrying a lot," she continued. "The worst thing you could do is undermine him when he's building something for the family." For the family. Always that phrase. I told her I wasn't undermining anything. I was asking questions. "Well," she said, "sometimes questions feel like accusations." That was the second dismissal. This one came with witnesses. Over the next week, the narrative tightened around me. Daniel mentioned casually that his accountant thought I was spiraling a bit. His mother asked if I was sleeping enough. A family friend suggested yoga. You wouldn't believe how quickly concern becomes consensus when one person controls the story. At home, Daniel grew smoother. Kinder. He brought flowers. He reminded me of trips we used to plan. He said, "We've always trusted each other, like a suggestion, not a fact." Trust, offered only after it's been violated, is not trust. It's a distraction. The smallest moment, the one that changed everything, happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was sorting mail when I noticed an envelope addressed to a business entity I didn't recognize. The return address belonged to a law firm. Inside was a notice referencing a shell company newly registered, minimal history, no public footprint yet. The registered agent was a woman. The same email as the credit account. I sat at the kitchen table and read the notice 3 times. Then I did something simple. I opened a notebook. Not a journal, a ledger. I wrote down dates, cross-referenced filings, mapped timelines. I didn't label Daniel as a villain. I labeled him as a variable. That was the moment the story changed internally. Not because I was hurt, because I understood the shape of what was happening. This wasn't impulse, it was preparation. That night, Daniel asked if I was okay. I said yes, and I meant it. Because confusion had ended. From that point on, I stopped asking questions meant to be answered aloud. I asked the ones that documents answer quietly. If you were in my position, you might have confronted him, you might have demanded honesty. I didn't. I let the misunderstanding stand. Because misunderstandings, when allowed to grow, expose intent. And intent, once documented, becomes leverage. I went to bed that night knowing one thing clearly. Whatever Daniel was planning, he believed I was the obstacle least likely to notice. That belief was his mistake. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no speech, no decision made out loud. It began the morning I stopped explaining myself. Daniel asked why I was quiet at breakfast. I said I was thinking. He accepted that answer easily, too easily. He preferred me thoughtful over curious. From that day on, I stopped trying to be seen as reasonable. I focused on being accurate. I returned to habits I hadn't used in years. I woke earlier. I organized information instead of emotions. I treated my own marriage like a file that needed review. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I needed clarity before I moved in any direction. I requested copies of documents under ordinary pretenses, insurance updates, tax prep, school forms that required financial disclosures. Daniel forwarded them without concern. He still believed I was operating inside the boundaries he had set. He didn't notice that I was rebuilding my map. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I compared signatures. I tracked dates across accounts. I noticed how transactions clustered around certain weeks, always when Daniel traveled. Always when he said meetings ran long. There was no anger in the process. That surprised me. The work required too much concentration for resentment. At one point, I realized something important. Daniel wasn't hiding money impulsively. He was reorganizing ownership, moving assets into structures that looked legitimate unless you knew where to look. That level of planning requires confidence. Confidence comes from believing no one is watching. I didn't confront him when I found inconsistencies. I stopped reacting entirely. No raised eyebrows, no pauses, no emotional tells. Silence, when it's intentional, unsettles people who rely on dominance. Daniel tried to reassert control in small ways. He made jokes about my organizational phase. He reminded me twice that he appreciated how easygoing I was compared to other wives he knew. I smiled and said nothing. Behind the scenes, I contacted a former colleague, not for advice, for confirmation. I asked one question. If someone wanted to quietly transfer marital assets without triggering immediate alarms, how would they do it? The answer came back concise, familiar, disturbingly aligned with what I was already seeing. That was when I stopped hoping I was wrong. The turning point wasn't rage, it was recognition. I opened a new email account under my maiden name. I backed up files to a secure drive. I scanned physical documents Daniel assumed were irrelevant: old loan agreements, operating statements, incorporation drafts. Each document removed a layer of fog. I wasn't building a case yet. I was building certainty. Daniel mistook my calm for relief. One evening, he said, "I'm glad you're not stressing anymore. It makes things easier." Easier for whom, he didn't specify. I realized then that I had been cast in a role long before I accepted it. The agreeable spouse. The non-threatening witness. The woman whose presence validated his control. I stepped out of that role quietly. There was one night I almost broke my silence. Daniel mentioned Ava's name for the first time casually, as a consultant helping with branding. He watched my face carefully. I kept my expression neutral. "Sounds useful," I said. That was the moment power shifted. He didn't know it yet, but the exchange revealed something critical. He believed he was introducing new information. He had no idea how far behind he already was. From that point on, I stopped asking for reassurance. I stopped seeking alignment. I stopped negotiating reality. I began documenting it. I wrote timelines that showed intent, not just action. I highlighted overlaps. I marked contradictions. I saved everything twice. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is loud. This was preparation. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. The begging phase, the one Daniel expected, never arrived. There were no tears, no ultimatums, no late-night conversations searching for honesty. Clarity replaces desperation the moment you accept that someone has already chosen themselves over you. By the end of that month, I knew enough to protect myself. Not emotionally, legally, financially, structurally. The power transfer was complete. Even though nothing outward had changed, Daniel still thought he was managing me. In reality, I had stopped being manageable. The truth didn't arrive as a single revelation. It assembled itself. Once I stopped doubting my instincts, the evidence lined up with a kind of precision that felt almost impersonal. Dates matched. Amounts repeated. The same routing patterns appeared across different institutions, always just below thresholds that triggered automatic review. Daniel wasn't careless. He was confident. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney on a Wednesday morning, under the pretense of a routine errand. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't need to. At that point, my words carried less weight than my documents. The attorney didn't interrupt as I spoke. She flipped through the folders slowly, methodically. When she reached the shell company filings, she stopped. "This wasn't accidental," she said. I nodded. "I know." She explained the structure back to me in neutral terms. Asset diversion, misrepresentation, potential forgery of spousal consent. Each phrase landed cleanly, without drama. Language matters. Once something has a legal name, it stops being personal. We discussed next steps. Not confrontation, preservation, affidavits, account freezes, a forensic accountant. I left her office lighter than I expected. Not relieved. Or vindicated. Just oriented. The accountant confirmed what I already suspected. Funds had been moved incrementally over 14 months. Ava wasn't a side note. She was an endpoint. Accounts in her name. Companies registered under her control. Assets repositioned as if Daniel were already planning his exit. What surprised me wasn't the betrayal. It was the assumption behind it that I would never trace it. The counterattack wasn't loud. It didn't involve threats or exposure. It involved timing. My attorney filed notices quietly. Requests for documentation. Preservation orders sent to banks before Daniel realized anything was wrong. The accounts didn't close. They paused. Daniel found out when his card declined at a restaurant. He came home irritated, confused. "Something's wrong with the accounts," he said. I looked up from the table. "That's possible." That was all. The formal reveal happened during mediation, which Daniel had agreed to casually, believing it was a procedural step before finalizing his control. He walked in relaxed. Ava wasn't present. He didn't think she needed to be. I sat across from him with my attorney. A binder rested between us. Clean, labeled. Daniel started speaking first. He talked about stress, about growth, about misunderstandings. He used words like temporary and necessary. Then my attorney slid the first document across the table. Transaction records. Dates highlighted. Signatures enlarged. Daniel stopped talking. The mediator asked him to respond. He tried. He corrected one detail. Then another document appeared. Then another. Each one narrower, more precise. There was no argument because there was no space left for one. When the shell company registration surfaced with Ava's name printed clearly as owner, Daniel's posture changed. He leaned back. He crossed his arms. Defensive, not angry. "This isn't what it looks like," he said. No one asked him to explain further. The collapse of false power isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It happens when an audience stops believing you. The mediator paused the session. Daniel asked for a break. My attorney declined on procedural grounds. By the end of that afternoon, the narrative Daniel had built for over a year unraveled in less than an hour. Not because I accused him, because I documented him. He tried to speak to me privately afterward. I didn't agree. My boundaries were already in place. Communication moved through counsel. That wasn't punishment. That was containment. Word traveled quickly through the family. The same people who once advised me to stay calm now urged discretion. They wanted to protect Daniel, to minimize damage. I refused to soften facts to preserve appearances. This wasn't revenge. This was correction. Daniel lost leverage the moment the evidence entered the room. Everything he had relied on, my silence, my hesitation, my concern for harmony, became irrelevant. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The climax wasn't exposure. It was alignment. Reality matching records. Records matching truth. For the first time in a long while, the ground felt solid beneath me. Once the facts were on record, the tone around me changed. Not immediately. Not honestly. But noticeably. Daniel's family stopped talking about misunderstandings and started talking about resolution. They used words like closure and moving forward. The implication was clear. The truth was inconvenient, and therefore negotiable. Marilyn called first. Her voice was careful now, measured. "This has gotten bigger than it needed to be," she said. "Everyone's embarrassed. Maybe it's time to calm things down." I asked her what that meant. "Well," she said, "maybe you don't need to push this so far. You've made your point." That was the moment I understood something important. To them, truth was a volume knob. Turn it down, and the discomfort fades. "I'm not pushing anything," I said. "I'm responding." She didn't like that answer. Daniel's mother followed. She cried softly, said she was worried about Ethan, said court records last forever, said families survive by letting things go. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said, "Ethan will be fine. What he doesn't need is to grow up thinking accountability is optional." Silence stretched on the line. Then she said goodbye. Daniel himself tried one last approach. Not anger, negotiation. He sent a message asking to talk, just us. No lawyers, no paperwork. Like we used to. I didn't respond. Instead, my attorney sent a formal notice outlining communication boundaries and next procedural steps. Clear, polite, final. That refusal to compromise, to soothe, to make it easier, was harder than any confrontation would have been. Standing your ground quietly invites pressure. People lean in, assuming you'll move. I didn't. I wasn't interested in punishing Daniel. I was interested in accuracy, in restoration where possible, in limits where necessary. We agreed to nothing outside documented channels, no verbal assurances, no emotional bargaining, no side deals. When Daniel proposed a private settlement that excluded certain disclosures, I declined. When he suggested we protect his reputation for Ethan's sake, I declined. When he implied this would all go away if I stopped insisting on full transparency, I declined. Boundaries are only effective when they're boring. The process moved forward without spectacle. Assets were evaluated. Responsibilities reassigned. Temporary orders put into place. Each step stripped Daniel of the assumption that he could steer the outcome with charm. I didn't correct the family when they framed my behavior as cold. Coldness implies absence of feeling. This wasn't that. This was presence. For the first time in years, decisions were made without considering how they would be received, only whether they were correct. There were moments, quiet ones, when doubt crept in, not about the facts, about the cost, about how many relationships would thin or disappear entirely once I refused to play my part. Then I would open the file, read the records, re-anchor myself in what was real. Clarity has weight. It keeps you steady when others try to move you with emotion. By the time formal separation terms were outlined, there was nothing left to argue about. The story had already been told by documents, not voices. I didn't win anything in the way people imagine winning. I established boundaries and enforced them. That was enough. And once that was done, the noise began to fade. Leaving didn't feel dramatic. It felt logistical. I chose an apartment 15 minutes from Ethan's school. 2 bedrooms, quiet building. Nothing that looked like a statement. I signed the lease on a Thursday and started packing the next morning. Daniel watched without understanding what he was seeing. He assumed there would be a scene, that I would cry over furniture, over memories, over the shape of the life we were dismantling. Instead, I sorted efficiently. Documents first, then clothes, then objects that still served a purpose. I left behind what was symbolic. I took what was necessary. Daniel tried to talk to me as I packed. He stood in doorways. He asked practical questions with emotional subtext. Where are you going to put the piano? Do you really need to take all of that? We should slow down. Inedid aft praise. I answered none of them. Silence, again, did the work. On the third day, he shifted tactics. The confidence was gone. In its place was urgency. You don't have to do this, he said. We can fix it. I looked at him, not with anger, with assessment. This is already fixed, I said. Just not for you. That was the closest I came to cruelty. And it wasn't cruelty. It was accuracy. He sat down after that. For a long time, he said nothing. Ethan took the move better than I expected. I didn't give him details. I didn't need to. Children understand structure more than explanation. We're going to live somewhere quieter for a while, I told him. He nodded. Okay. That was it. The morning I left, Daniel stood by the front door. He looked older, smaller, not ruined, just outpaced. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I believed he believed that. Intent doesn't erase impact. I didn't say that out loud. I hope you get what you're looking for, I said instead. He didn't respond. There was no victory in that moment. No satisfaction. Just a clean ending to a long misunderstanding. Driving away, I didn't look back at the house. I had already left it mentally weeks earlier. Physical departure is easier when the internal one is complete. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and new carpet, neutral, unclaimed. Ethan chose his room without hesitation. That first night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen counter and listened to the quiet. Not the fragile quiet of avoidance, the stable kind. Daniel sent one final message later that week. Not angry, resigned. I give up, he wrote. I didn't reply. Giving up implies a contest. This wasn't that. I wasn't walking away with a sense of triumph. I was walking away intact. That was enough. Consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded the way they usually do, quietly, in sequence, without commentary. Daniel's professional life began to narrow. Not collapse. Narrow. Contracts paused. Partners asked questions he couldn't answer quickly, the kind of questions that don't accuse, but require proof. Trust, once audited, doesn't rebound easily. The investigation into his financial practices didn't become public news. It didn't need to. Word moved where it mattered. Banks became cautious. Advisors distanced themselves. His name started appearing in conversations with a pause before it. Ava disappeared from the picture almost immediately. Not dramatically. Not with confrontation. She simply stopped showing up. Her shell companies dissolved as quietly as they had formed. The accounts linked to her name were frozen, then released under supervision. Whatever version of the future she had been promised evaporated once protection did. Daniel never mentioned her again. What remained was logistics. Settlements, reassignments, consequences that didn't scream, but pressed steadily. Ethan adjusted faster than I expected. He liked the predictability of the new routine. He stopped asking why his father canceled visits. I didn't fill in the blanks. Children are better at noticing patterns than we give them credit for. Daniel's family kept their distance, not out of anger, out of discomfort. The story they had relied on no longer worked, and no one was eager to replace it. I wasn't excluded. I was avoided. That was fine. On my side, things stabilized, not perfectly, but honestly. I returned to work in a senior compliance role. No announcements, no explanations. Just a desk, a title, and responsibilities I knew how to carry. The first time I signed off on a report again, I felt something settle into place. Competence has its own kind of peace. Financially, things corrected themselves over time. Not fully, but enough. Assets were rebalanced. Access restored. I wasn't made whole in a symbolic sense. I was made secure. That mattered more. People sometimes expect karma to look like punishment. I've learned it usually looks like exposure, like being seen clearly, without the narrative you built to protect yourself. Daniel wasn't ruined. He was revealed. The confidence he once carried never returned. When I saw him months later at a school event, he stood apart from other parents. Polite, careful, smaller in posture, not stature. He nodded when he saw me. I nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. What struck me most was how little I felt in that moment. No satisfaction, no bitterness, just distance. Karma doesn't always announce itself to the person who endured the harm. Sometimes it works quietly, rearranging the world until balance returns without ceremony. At home, evenings were calm. Ethan did homework at the kitchen table. I reviewed documents out of habit, not fear. We ate dinner without urgency. The noise was gone. I didn't gain something dramatic from all of this. I regained alignment. Between what I knew, what I said, and what I allowed. That alignment changed everything. A year passed without ceremony. No milestones worth announcing. No dramatic markers. Just time doing what time does when it's finally allowed to move forward. My life settled into a rhythm that didn't require explanation. Mornings were quiet. Ethan left for school on his own now. Older, steadier. We talked less about the past and more about ordinary things, projects, plans, what to make for dinner. Ordinary became a privilege. Work grounded me. I wasn't rebuilding myself. I was returning to a version of me that had been paused, not erased. Meetings were efficient. Decisions were clean. When I spoke, people listened not because of volume, but because what I said held up under review. That mattered more to me than validation. I kept my finances simple, transparent, boring. I checked statements regularly, not out of fear, but habit. Clarity is a discipline. Once learned, you don't abandon it. I didn't follow Daniel's life. Not intentionally. But some things surface anyway. He sold part of his business. Not strategically, reactively. He moved to a smaller place on the other side of town. People stopped asking me questions about him after a while. When there's no scandal to feed on, interest fades. That was fine. The brief encounter happened on a cold afternoon in early winter. I was leaving a school meeting when I saw him in the parking lot, waiting for someone else. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. "Laura," he said. I stopped. Not out of obligation, out of choice. We stood there for a moment. Two people who had shared a life, now sharing nothing but space. "I hope you're doing well," he said. "I am," I replied. That was true. Not defiantly. Simply. He hesitated. There were words behind his eyes, regret, maybe, or the desire to reframe what had happened. I didn't give him the opening. "I have to go," I said. He nodded. "Take care." I walked away without relief or tension. Just completion. That was the ending I hadn't known to want. At home that evening, I made dinner and listened to Ethan talk about a science project. Later, after he went to bed, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the city lights settle into place. No triumph. No bitterness. No need to revisit the past to prove anything. I didn't win because Daniel lost. I won because I stopped participating in a reality that required my silence to function. There's a difference. People sometimes ask carefully if I would do anything differently. They expect regret, or anger, or some version of self-blame softened into wisdom. The truth is simpler. I would listen sooner. I would document earlier. I would trust clarity over comfort every time. But I don't dwell on that. The life I live now isn't built on reaction. It's built on boundaries, on records, on decisions made without apology. It's quieter than the one I left behind, and stronger. If this story stayed with you, you can support the channel by liking the video or subscribing. It helps these stories reach others who might need them. And if you feel like sharing, leave a comment with the city you're listening from. Sometimes knowing we're not alone is enough.